if there's floor to ceiling, wall to wall glass, if there's steel in the ceiling that is operating with very tight tolerances, if the foundation's off, that might require, an adjustment to the window schedule.
We've learned the hard way in the past that, okay, we're gonna really review that truss layout when we get those shop drawing. Make sure that we have them all spaced out that allow our perfect ceiling plan to actually come to fruition during construction. Because oftentimes, we'll show up on site and there will be something misaligned. It's not aligning with that window, the center line of that window, but there's a big girder truss right there. We can't move it. So there's a lot of
so many things
to look out for.
Yeah, there's so many things to think through in that, and you just learn by experience.
Yeah.
All right, so 10 minutes ago I said let's kind of get in and walk through a house from phases. We got sidetracked, but it was a great conversation. So I just wanted to touch on some of the different phases of construction and talk about some of the complexities that can occur. And foundations. Every house has to start with a great foundation. But with a modern house, you can have again these floor to ceiling windows and doors, really clean lines. So if your foundation isn't spot on, you're going to see it. And a pretty typical foundation variation on new construction, you think about a house, let's just about like a large custom home, 5, 6, 7,000 square feet. That house might be 70, 80, 100 feet wide. It's okay for that slab. It's within tolerance, let's say, for that slab to be off an inch or two from the left side to the right side. It's pretty common, right? But when you are dealing with something, again, you don't have the millwork, you don't have some of the things to hide some of that sin, that 1 or 2 inch tolerance may not be acceptable for that type of job, right?
And it's kind of a ripple effect as the finishing of the project happens. Then the framer has to kind of compensate for those changes. All the finish crews have to compensate for that adjustment in the slab just to make sure that everything turns out plumb.
Yeah. And you're eventually going to see it somewhere. I mean, you can't completely hide it. At some point, that's going to show up.
And, kind of speaking to something we touched on earlier, if there's floor to ceiling, wall to wall glass, if there's steel in the ceiling that is operating with very tight tolerances, if the foundation's off, that might require an adjustment to the window schedule. Like if you're trying to accommodate it, or the steel fabricator might be working on shops and suddenly you're like, hey, have you made that column yet? We need to adjust our steel frame to accommodate this foundation, because even that first step, the foundation is linked to so many elements depending on the design.
And usually those windows are ordered maybe before the foundation's poured.
Right.
So
well, and that's like a really big challenge now post-COVID is the lead times on certain items like windows and doors. It used to be garage doors for a while. I think we're past that.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, we're ordering these elements of the home so far in advance before the foundation is poured. So it needs to be right. We need to be able to bring those things in when they're finally ready and have it just go in smoothly.
Yeah. I mean, typically on most houses, you're over framing your windows and door openings, giving yourself a margin of error for fitting things, but that's not always the case. Again, if you're trying to get certain things to align a certain way, you don't really have that luxury. So, yeah, if you're wood framing or steel framing or your foundation's off, you're in trouble there. And the same thing with with your floor being out of level. A lot of times we can just throw some self-level on that thing, level it up, and just kind of roll with it. That happen. I mean, I would say most houses get a fair amount of self-leveling compound put down under wood floors or tile or whatever it is. But that's not always an option when you're going for minimalism.
Right.
Yeah, especially if the windows have already been ordered to be a certain height, and suddenly you're adding new layers of material on top that might change that floor to floor floor to ceiling height.
Yeah, and going back to the kind of the quality of your carpentry crew. If that floor is not level and you want your baseboards to appear level, you better have a good carpenter who's capable of kind of scribing that stuff to the floor and following those contours to kind of make it disappear as best that you can.
Right.
I think most trim carpenters either don't know or don't want to take the time to really do scribing like they should to cover some of that stuff.
Caulk can't hide everything.
No.
I've learned that.
And you don't want a big old fat bead of white caulk between your baseboards and and the floors. So, all right. So framing, we already touched on this some, but a lot of times in modern architecture, we got a lot of steel framing. We got a lot of big beams to create these open expanses and glass expanses. But also when you have tall wall volumes and then you've got a lot of light coming in from across the room or a lot of light coming in adjacent to it, any little flaw in that wall framing is going to be accentuated when the light hits it too.
Yeah, it's going to broadcast it. Yeah, when you've got flush materials and things, those deviations are suddenly going to be on display, along that joint. Something else that we've seen kind of play out recently is, if you have, say, large cantilevers or large kind of broad surfaces, ceilings and walls, expected deflection, structural deflection becomes something that suddenly you're sort of in the structural engineer's business because modern architecture is typically straight and not like droopy. And so, if it's wood, you want to understand that deflection over time. If it's steel, you want to understand that deflection under certain loads. And kind of going back to a good engineer is going to help you with that as well. But that's just another element that could lead to kind of dissatisfaction, especially when it comes to finishes, because you can come up with some fixes, but sometimes you kind of run into a brick wall in terms of like the extent to which you can make something like that go away.
And I think that goes back to, the amount of tolerance that's generally acceptable for a normal project isn't always acceptable in a modern project. So, like in this instance, we had beams that were within, a very tolerable deflection that were designed, but it was not acceptable for our specific design. And we just need to be able to catch that up front and communicate that need up front.
Yeah, we did a project a few years ago with some very long expanses over a living room with a sloped ceiling, and the ceiling was formed by trusses, and kind of right at the midpoint of that, I think there was like a little anyway. My terminology here is off, but there was a flat ceiling that transitioned up into a vaulted ceiling.
Okay.
And right where the trusses crossed that, it was kind of the midpoint on the truss, and there was like some deflection on there, just from wind load or whatever from the roof, and that caulk joint or that joint in the drywall right there at that intersection kept popping over time, and after drywall, after paint, there's really nothing that I can do structurally to go in and fix that. So that's one of those instances we had to tell the customer, kind of due to the engineering here, this is something that you might deal with for the whole time that you own this house. Because that engineering detail wasn't thought through. Like, we probably should have upsized those or done something to stiffen them or brace them, right? So that's not something that somebody wants to hear after they've spent a couple $1,000,000 on the house. Oh, you're going to get some cracks there once a year. You have to touch them up.
Yeah, they don't want to do the aesthetic maintenance every year on a crack.
So, another option that we gave them, which they ended up not doing, was, hey, we could apply some kind of cladding to the ceiling, stop it short of that joint by 1/8 of an inch or something like that. And that's kind of the flex point. So if it does move a little bit, you're not going to see it. Yeah, they ended up not wanting to do it, but.
Right.
Yeah.
These custom houses they're kind of like building a custom car, like there's so many things you're doing for the first time. Like, this is a unique design. And so it takes a strong team to anticipate issues like that, because they're looking at a certain combination of elements that maybe no one else has like done before, at least on the team. And so it's just more coordination, more foresight to say, hey, we're going to have an issue here. I mean, it's a tall order, I think, for these teams to really pull these things off. And I mean, that's why it takes 18 months, 2 years to build really great houses, because it's a complicated thing to put together.
Yeah. All right. So exterior finishes was the next thing I wanted to hit on. My observation, and tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, but my observation is a lot of modern residential exterior cladding systems often you see first in like a commercial architecture, or people see something in commercial, they apply it to residential, or a lot of these kind of new design products and concepts will originate in commercial, right?
I think so, yeah.
And so that further complicates things when you're taking something that, again, your cornice crew, your framing crew, your exterior finish crew has probably never seen or touched before. Now you're asking them to do it, right? And so, rarely are we looking. I mean, again, it depends on the house, but it's not usually straightforward like fiber cement lap siding or a straightforward traditional brick design.
Yeah.
And so anytime we get into these more complicated cladding systems, there's just more opportunity for conflict.
Well, and I would say more often than not, at least for us and how we design modern houses, we are using more traditional materials, but detailing them and applying them in a more modern way. So even though it's a stucco home, maybe that stucco's on a concrete substrate with no control joints. But, maybe an unsophisticated sub will say, oh, it's just stucco, and he's thinking, I'm just going to do it how I always do it. But really, it's not. It's not the same process. There's a learning curve. There's a very specific application to achieve that minimal detailing that we're expecting with the traditional material.
There's also often a lot of specialty fasteners involved. I'm thinking of one project right now that we're helping kind of rescue, quote unquote, and it was designed with fiber cement siding, but the fiber cement siding was individually cut into little short pieces, and then each piece was installed on a rain screen system with like 4 little custom fasteners on it. So the whole outside of the house is like these individual little planks separated by an 1/8 inch reveal all the way around with exposed fasteners. And all that's got to be like spot on to make it look right. And it's also expensive because that stuff, like every piece is custom cut. There's a lot of labor that goes into it. And if the person putting the screw in that, overdrives the screw, it breaks. Now you're cutting another one. So,
yeah, I think some traditional finishes are coming from historical kind of tradition of building, much more practical kind of foundation for how things were built maybe a long time ago, versus some modern stuff is more ornamental and kind of style based, right? And so you get things like that where it's kind of an exaggerated end of the spectrum of like, those planks could be a lot longer. They could have far fewer joints and fasteners, but it's an aesthetic choice. It's generating a different kind of performance. And I think another layer to that is just how these finishes, new or old, are all interacting with, new building envelopes, which is another layer of kind of what a sophisticated builder would bring to the table, an understanding and a familiarity with latest and greatest way to seal up a house. And so I mean, if you don't have that building envelope nice and buttoned up, and you've got a kind of wonky attempt to install an ambitious modern facade. It could just be like compounded issues on top of each other. And of course, if it's one thing when it's like busted sheetrock and doors that won't close. It's another one. It's like water coming into the house. So high stakes out there.
All right, so to kind of go along with that is glazing systems, and windows and doors. So just we've talked about some of the complexities on that, but just the cost aspect of it. Those things can get real expensive real quick, and so when people are talking about, why does this house cost so much more to build? Well, that 12, 15, 20 foot multi-slide door could be that could be a $20,000 or $30,000 line item right there just for the door. And then you still got like some specialty labor to install it, because you're not going to let your framer install that or your trim carpenter. Like, you want a dedicated window and door installer who's used to dealing with these things, and that could be another $5,000 to $10,000 for that guy. So now this one window wall in your house, that if you use kind of traditional windows and setups, that might be $10,000. Now you're spending $50,000 or $60,000 on that one wall.
Right. Not to mention the framing considerations that have to go in beforehand to make that opening possible.
Yeah, big steel beam or engineered beam across the top of it.
Yeah. Well, so a punched opening on a say a traditional house. Say the opening's a little off. Well, you can go in, adjust the framing. No big deal. Like maybe at the end of the day, it's a couple inches off of where it should be. But if it's a punched opening floating on a facade somewhere, there may not be a lot of elements where you can visually check for that position. But if it's modern design and if it's floor to ceiling or something like that, understanding the rough opening requirements for a floor to ceiling installation suddenly becomes super critical, because as a designer, you may be thinking, oh, well, these are 10-foot ceilings, so my unit is 10 feet tall. But you've got
we want that sill to be flush with the finished floor.
Right.
We want all these things to line up.
I was just about to mention that.
Really 10 foot 2 1/4.
Yeah, it's something crazy like that. And then you go review on site, and it's not 10 foot 2 1/4 over here. And you think, well, is that a problem yet? You know, like you really have to think through that stuff. And it's just more coordination and more pressure on that framing to be nailed down correctly.
And that can go back to foundation too, because if you're not, and most people don't want to walk up to a multi-slide door and have a inch or two sill that they're stepping over, right? And so it goes back to, you've got to plan your foundation pour and drop that slab at that area, so that's going to flush out. So, your concrete guy, your project manager need to have the specs for the door unit to know how tall that sill is. Double check that before it gets poured. Otherwise, you're going to be saw cutting and jackhammering concrete, and hopefully that's not your finished floor.
Yeah, and then, to have the finished floor already selected by then is really critical. A lot of times, homeowners assume that they can select their tile or their wood floors, way down the road, but really we need to start coordinating those things from the get-go.
Yeah, if it's 3/8 or 5/8 or 3/4 inch flooring, you need to know that when you're setting that door unit, or when you're pouring the slab or framing it or whatever, for sure. If you found value in this episode of Your Project Shepherd podcast, please consider leaving us a review and sharing it with your friends. That helps us expand our reach and bring this content to more people. Thanks for being here. All right, let's talk about roofing. So typically, like, the cheapest roof that you can do on a house is a composition shingle roof. But with modern, we're dealing typically with a lot of flat roofs or low pitched,
right?
Which is going to mean TPO or modified bitumen or standing seam metal roof or something like that. So all of those are at the upper end of the price spectrum as opposed to composition shingles. So they're probably 3 or 4x the cost of composition shingles. So that's a big cost driver. But also there's a lot of detailing that goes into that too, to make sure that your waterproofing is done properly and that thing's going to drain right.
Right.
A lot of times with the flat roofs, we do encounter some internal drains that are necessary. So we need to detail and plan for that coming through the house and exiting properly.
Redundancy to
Yes.
the drain itself, or the design, the drain at the roof. And some of these things are quite typical in a commercial sense. And so this is kind of an instance where if a contractor doesn't have great relationships with some subs, like a roofing sub who does have a decent amount of commercial experience, this will be a sort of learning curve if they're trying to use one of the same old guys, you know, and for those reasons, because I do find that sometimes when we draw something like that, like a flat roof, we get kind of frowny faces from the team. And then, you know, we're thinking, well, but I'm pretty sure that Sam's roof has something really similar, you know?
Yeah.
And like, if they can do it, you know, and all their locations, like surely there's a smart way we could do this here too. And, you know, some of that, it comes back on the architect to kind of know how to design it in a way to accommodate the roofer to be able to design it in a smart, long-term, durable way versus some like craft project way that's like
Right.
super high maintenance and, you know, vulnerable in storms and things. So,
Yeah. Going back to the flat roofs, it also kind of minimizes your attic space a lot of times. So as architects, we try to, you know, compensate for that by, you know, dropping our ceilings. We're not having low ceilings, but just making sure we have enough sandwich between that flat roof and the finished ceiling to run our ducts, to, you know, have everything that we need, have access if we need it. And I think that's something that's overlooked a lot of times in the early stages of design, and it only comes out later when we're pricing or working with the mechanical sub, and he's like, how am I going to get my duct in there? And so then we go back and kind of rework the design. So yeah, attic space and flat roofs are a challenge.
Yeah. So my next category is HVAC. So that's a great transition into that. Yeah. So using a open web truss system to form your roof on modern is a great way to make life easier for the mechanical contractor and the plumbing and electrical and everything, right?
Yeah.
But making sure that you're using a big enough open web truss to actually get those ducts where they need to go. It can't be 12 or 16 or 18 inches. It needs to be 20, 24, you know.
and make
like
sure
that.
they're stiff as well, which kind of, you know, in terms of finishes, making sure that you can have a nice finish installation. But I mean, that kind of, I'm moving on from HVAC, but
also without that traditional attic space that you can walk into, we've been designing modern homes with just walk-in mechanical rooms where your HVAC is a vertical unit in this generous closet. But we need to do some work to convince our clients to say, hey, okay, if you want this really thin roof profile, we're going to have to take that square footage away from your, you know, dwelling and give that to HVAC, because that's really important.
And maybe even more than one. So if you've got a spread out house and you've got a big ceiling volume in the middle of it, you may have to have mechanical room on each side of the house because there's no way to get ducts from point A to point B. Right. And so it's, you know, we've talked about the contractor having a lot of coordination and thinking through these things. This is one of those things where during the planning phase, the architect and the engineer need to work with not only the builder but also an HVAC designer. I know you guys work with Toner some. I do too. You know, so Toner and his team do HVAC design with us. But it's let's get some ducts on a plan. Let's figure out how we're going to duct this thing also.
Right.
So it's just another layer of drawings that probably need to be done before stuff even gets bid out. Honestly.
Yeah. And you know, of course, there's going to be a lot of slot diffusers, or you know, we love trimless grills and alignments with things, right? And getting all that to look right, whether it's a wood ceiling where you want things to line up well with the wood planks, or it's just a drywall ceiling where you're aligning lights with diffusers with, I don't know, some other security device, right? Like these are just layers of coordination, including the HVAC sub,
and
to make sure it all looks good together.
It all actually starts with that truss layout. So we've learned the hard way in the past that, okay, we're gonna really review that truss layout when we get those shop drawings from the truss manufacturer. Make sure that we have them all spaced out that allow our perfect ceiling plan to actually come to fruition during construction, because oftentimes, we'll show up on site and there will be something misaligned. It's not aligning with that window, the center line of that window, but there's a big girder truss right there. We can't move it. So there's a lot of
so many things
to look out for.
Yeah, there's so many things to think through in that, and you just learn by experience.
Yeah.
We just had that instance. In fact, on the same house I'm talking about with the polished concrete floors, we thought everything was coordinated really, really well. Great architect, great engineer, but the truss layouts did not get coordinated. And so they had some big skylights in the living room that they wanted to kind of have a certain shape and kind of a flare out from the skylight, and couldn't do it because of the truss spacing. And so we had to kind of have a site meeting and kind of step back a little bit and figure out how to work that out. And fortunately, the truss engineer said, "Hey, it's okay if you space those out just a little bit," and so we made it work. But that's a high level of coordination that needs to take place early on for that. And so also to go along with that comment about your ceiling layouts, and this kind of leads into electrical, which is my next item. I've said many times we think it's really, really important to have a kind of before ducts get pulled, before wires get run, before pipes get run. Let's do a we call it a box and can walkthrough. Just have the HVAC guy go in there and pop in his register boxes where they're going. Have the electrician pop in his can rough ends and switch boxes, no wires. And let's get the architect, get the designer. Let's walk through and say, is this working?
Right.
Is this what you expected? Because there's typically no change orders at that point if something has to get moved. It's once they start running wires and ducts, they want to ding you if something has to change.
One of our favorite drawings are the ceiling framing plans, where basically from a drawing standpoint, like every layer is turned on. Mechanical, electrical, security, in the framer as well, right? Where it's that first attempt at being able to show what framing layout will help achieve all the design goals. And I don't just mean, like a structural engineer's framing plan where they draw arrows and say 16 inches on center, where we have our light placement first, and then the center of the room has a gap, between two ceiling joists, because it's allowing whatever we want to be there instead of a 2x10, ceiling joist, like right in the middle. And, it's still quite an effort to coordinate everything, but I find that those ceiling framing plans are they're a great tool for the contractor, because they're seeing it all at the same time as well. They're not having to flip through pages and say, well, where's this? Where's this? Because it's just all there.
I like that idea.
And I think that with modern home design, we're really leaning into this minimal lighting language. Lighting art walls, having accent lighting, not just the typical 4 cans in each corner of the room. So there's less tolerance on like where those lights can go and where they're best suited and can achieve that feel that we're looking for. And so coordinating with the framing plan way ahead of time has saved the day on many projects for us.
And those are probably not just the typical 6-inch round Halo or Home Depot commercial electric recessed can boxes, right? So again, that's another cost element. You go from I'm not knocking those because they have their place in certain things, but like you buy the value builders pack of the 6-inch round trims and they're $7 or $8 a piece.
Yeah.
Right. But you get into something that's got maybe some depth to it, so you don't get glare, or maybe get into a square can or all the many variations of that. Those might be $50, $75, $100 a piece. So now you've got a pretty big delta in just the cost of the actual fixture. So again, when the question comes up is why is this costing so much more? Well, that's a great example.
Yeah. And something recently we've encountered is just, with these new finishes that people are wanting for their ceilings, a thicker, like a wood finish, for example, on the ceiling, it requires them to actually purchase like an extension kit for those recessed cans in some cases. So that's just another layer of thought and detail and expense.
Yeah. And, it's always uncomfortable when they've roughed in the lights and they're, say there's sheetrock before like a wood ceiling or something, and they realize, wait, we didn't actually drop all those cans. They're all too high or something, or, whatever it might be. I mean, yeah, it takes a lot of planning to pull it off. There's
a lot of ways for a builder to not make as much money as he wanted to make on this. Ask me how I know.
Yes.
Because guess what? The homeowner's not going to eat that cost. So, so plumbing, kind of more of the same type of thing, but I'm thinking about plumbing differences like a lot of wall mounted faucets are very clean, exposed water lines and traps on vanities and things like a powder bath vanity. Or
my favorite struggle is the linear shower drain.
That was my next item, linear shower drain.
Yeah, yes. Especially when you want it to be on the wall, on the edge.
Right against, yeah.
There's always a beam down below, right where it would, in order for the drain to really be in the right place, like you would have to be in the beam, and so then it comes off the wall, and it's like, oh, that's sad. There's a little like 1-inch shelf before it drops in. It's like, how long has this been in the drawings? Yeah, planning.
Well, that could also be just having that detailed out on the architectural, so that the foundation guy doesn't put a beam right there, so that can get put there. I like the ones, and I have not used them yet, but I want to use them soon, where the drain is actually like in the sidewall.
Have
you seen those? That. So so instead of a drain like right in the floor against the vertical wall, the drain is actually in the sidewall, so the water kind of like disappears into the wall and goes down.
Oh, that's very cool.
I want to try one of those.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So also to go along with that, just kind of the flush entry showers, kind of the 0 entry showers is always a challenge on waterproofing too, and how do you make that transition from the bathroom into the shower? That's you can't do a normal shower pan that's wrapped up because there's nothing for it to there's no curve for it to terminate at and wrap over.
And then I was gonna say, and similarly with the wall finish of showers, we're starting to see that really minimal look of maybe it is painted sheetrock in the bathroom, but then it transitions to like a waterproof plaster that looks like sheetrock. And that also has its challenges of where do we transition that material? How do we waterproof it? And it's just some added cost here and there for that minimal look.
We're doing one right now that I can't. We're so close to it being done. I can't wait to get some pictures of it. But again, David Miller, Duncan Miller, he did his concrete micro topping finish on all the shower walls, all the tub walls, all the floor in the bathrooms. The whole bathroom's like this monolithic thing.
Yes.
Great,
and
great
I can't wait to get some pictures on how that looks. It's pretty cool. It's pretty sweet.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
But pulling it off's a pain though.
Yes.
One of the other things I was remembering about the seamless, sort of accessible shower detail is that the drain still needs to be technically like 2.5 inches or something lower than some curb, per code. And so it just puts more pressure on that planning beforehand. Does the slab have the drop required, or do you have enough space in that floor framing, say it's a second second floor bath to accommodate that drop.
So kind of on the topic of walls, so drywall finishes. Again, we talked earlier about there's no kind of molding to kind of cheat your drywall, especially at the corners at the base, oftentimes, or something we've been asked to do many times is do a reveal system around interior doors and above baseboards. And if you don't budget for that can double your drywall cost, integrating some kind of like metal reveal system. And your drywall guy may not be the right guy to do that. Like we like to have our trim carpenters actually install all those metal reveals, and the drywall guy is going to do the floating to it. But our guys are going in there and setting lasers, putting in that metal, and then letting them float to it. But I have a hard time trusting a drywall guy to get all those reveals spot on, especially when you have this like the continuous line across the baseboard, up the door, around the corner. Man, that's hard to pull off.
And it's crazy that your eye can really see that 1/8 of an inch difference. If it's installed just a little bit off or a little bit wavy, it really grabs your attention. So it's a very important step.
Yeah. Even around windows, doing like a trimless window. Again, I'm not trying to constantly brag on my trim carpenters, but I do have my trim guys go in. In fact, that's where they are today. They are going around to every single window opening before drywall, and they're basically putting in kind of like a plywood subframe that's going to go behind the finished drywall, but they're squaring up every single window in advance for the drywall guy, because if you don't have any wood finish on that window, no sills, ledges, whatever, no casing, you'll see it easily if that window opening's not spot on, because all that light's coming in there, and it'll highlight it.
Especially if you're dealing with small pieces of sheetrock, if you're relying on the rigidity of the sheetrock itself, and the sheetrock has been sliced and diced, it's just going to be hard for you to be able to rely on it to create that crisp edge.
Right.
You can try to mud it into submission, but you can only go so far with that.
Yeah.
Right. Especially on these modern houses where we want that level 4 or 5 smooth finish. We don't want texture or anything to cover up the sins. So you're going to see that translate through if that extra work isn't done beforehand.
So level kind of, I'll call it like a level 4 plus, level 5 finish does take a lot more time, and using the right products. So, I call like a level 4 plus finish, which is a lot of times what we'll kind of do, where the drywall guy is skimming a little bit further out on his joints. So instead of, maybe an 8-inch, we're going out to 12 or 16-inch skim around the joints, and really taking the time to do a good sand, but then also applying like a really a good quality, thick, high build primer that's going to level out the walls when you put the primer on it too. Because again, when you have these walls with a lot of sunlight hitting them, you'll see those imperfections. We're actually working on a house in West University right now where a previous builder was supposed to give a level 4 or 5 finish, and they have this big 2-story stairwell that's 24 feet high with windows all the way up the stairwell. And ever since they moved in, they're like, every time that we walk up here in the sunlight, we see all these lines in the drywall, right? And so we're floating the whole wall from floor to ceiling, putting the right primer on it, and hopefully that turns out a lot better. But
right,
it's
better to do that the first time around.
Not after the living there and you're having to sand everything back down.
Yes.
So
I think what's perhaps like underappreciated is, I think it all comes down to trim. Maybe I think a lot of us grew up in houses with plenty of, crooked is maybe a harsh word to say, but not flat walls, but it was actually difficult to see it. Maybe over time, if you're hanging art or something, you would notice some things, but it was typically pretty forgiving based on the design of those homes. And even we've done some work on more traditional houses that are trying to pull from historic kind of aesthetics. And the kind of irony about all that is that a lot of historic kind of masonry structures are super wonky, but you don't really care because like it's so romantic or whatever. But a new construction version of a house that's trying to mimic that, the clients are like, but I want straight walls. Like they don't want a crooked wall. And
come on, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't it romantic?
Yeah. And so on a modern house, there's just nothing you could hide behind. I'm just reiterating what we've already talked about, but there is a kind of funny spectrum of where kind of lower quality wall finishing can be easier to hide, and it's not in modern projects for sure.
So the last couple categories that I have are like millwork and cabinets, and then getting into tile and countertops. So more of the finish work, more of the sexy stuff that you see, right? So millwork we've already talked about a lot between baseboards and door reveals and things like that. But cabinets, I think, people, again, they see a nice clean flat panel cabinet and they think, oh, that's simpler, it's less ornamentation, should be easier. And in some cases that's true. A flat panel cabinet door, a 12 by 24 flat panel cabinet door is cheaper to produce than a cabinet door that's a 5-piece door with a raised panel or whatever. That's true. But oftentimes it's the material spec. We often start getting into a lot of stained woods, and then you're wanting to match the grains.
Yes.
Or maybe it's an exotic wood or something like that. And so that can really jack up the cost of those cabinets, especially if you're doing grain matching. So you got 10 feet of cabinets floor to ceiling and you want all the grain on your walnut to flow together. That's an expensive bank of cabinets.
Yeah. And I would say in modern design we're seeing the full wall, floor to ceiling, wall to wall of cabinets. And we're starting to integrate things like the HVAC supply and return into those cabinets even. So there's a lot more coordination that needs to go into it up front. And then, the concealed hardware, even if you want that clean look, even though it's simple, we have this really sophisticated hardware that you can micro adjust to make it all look just perfect when it's all
or like
closed.
some touch latch hardware, things like that. That stuff starts to get pretty pricey.
Or even the pocketing hardware. Everybody wants those cool pocket doors that pocket and slide away, but it adds up.
Well, and traditional hardware is all, maybe not entirely, but a lot of it's face mounted. So all the panels are up and you can kind of come after the fact and do some measurements and plan for where you're going to pre-drill your holes for your handles or whatever. But if we have some sort of hardware that's actually integrated into the edge of the cabinet door, then it might be something that needs to be planned for and milled in the shop. This is all ahead of time. You don't get the luxury of kind of looking at it as a whole on site and then like measuring and then taking them down and cutting them. Like it's got to be right when it gets there.
Right.
I've had that come up several times with the little tab cabinet pulls where people, the cabinets are done. They're like, hey, here's the hardware we want. And
okay,
it's
are we going to have to recess those now? Or?
Yeah, and you only have 1/8 of an inch between your door and your drawer that's adjacent to it. It's like, you can't put those in there. So now you got to take those off. You've got to very precisely, because they're already painted or stained or a laminate finish or something like that. And you've got to very painstakingly router out every single one to get that installed.
Yeah.
We've had that happen as well.
The carpenters always love that. So kind of last category, tile and countertops, same song, second verse here. It's just advanced planning, right? The more information that we have early about the products that we're going to use. So thickness of tile. Oftentimes we want like large format tile in modern design. You want fewer grout joints. You go to these big 48 by 48 tiles, which are on the installation side. The tile installers charge more to install those because they're harder to handle.
Right.
They're a lot more fragile. And they require specialized equipment to cut. So they can't just use their tile saw that they usually have on their truck on site to cut those things, because they won't fit on that tile saw. So those are having to be cut sometimes on a CNC machine off site or on a large format tile saw off site. So that stuff takes a lot of special care to handle it, to install it. And then just the liability if one breaks, that one tile might be $200,
right?
And then hopefully they have more in that same, color lot, dye lot as well.
Yeah. This, my favorite thing to think and complain about in this category is, social media. We see great images of designs.
So it's AI.
Yeah, is it AI
Half
and
of it is.
totally fake? Is it essentially what I would call an art project and it's not durable at all? But like either the architect or the client sees this thing and they fall in love with it, and so the team on site has to be like, okay, so how are we gonna do this? Like, we don't have the information. Maybe it's a product, maybe it's not, and we have to kind of say, okay, so the drawer fronts are stone. Like, how did they do that?
Yeah.
But is it really just faux painted to look like
yeah.
stone?
And the photograph is far enough away where you can't, it looks great in the photograph.
Right.
There are some kind of calculated risks like that come along with trying to do something that's unique, that maybe wouldn't be something you'd expect to see in a traditional job. And the whole team has to be in on it. They have to be working together, listening to each other, and coming up with a plan that feels good all around.
So, all this stuff is a total pain in the butt. But you know what? To me, that's why I like doing these projects, because it's a pain. But as long as people are willing to pay for it and they understand why it costs what it costs, and they're okay with that, and it's not being forced on them through a change order maybe, but as long as they understand kind of what's driving the cost and they're willing to pay for it, like, I love getting shown something and be like, hey, can we do this? Yeah, let's figure out how to do that. Like, it's fun. Like, the process of doing something that's never been done before is really fun.
Yeah. The challenge of producing something really unique is always fun, for us at least. And I think that, when choosing your project team, having architects and the builder also enjoy doing stuff like that together, it really makes for a strong team, because without our help and without your cooperation and help, it can't happen.
Absolutely. To me, the worst scenario is when architect or interior designer are like, hey, here's an inspiration picture, figure it out. I'm like, you want me just to figure it out on my own? But what if you don't like how I figure it out?
I'm
right?
not sure you want.
Because I've seen some other people's versions of figuring it out that really aren't very good.
Yes.
But the collaborative process, as long as everybody understands, we're not just going to throw something out there and say, figure it out. Hey, let's all sit down, let's look at this, let's talk about options, and there's some mutual respect for knowledge and capabilities. I love kind of working out those fun details.
And that's when samples become so important too. Mock-ups, just to get the client's approval on something before we go ahead and do this new experiment, like across the entire house. We need to see different versions, different ways to do this the most effectively to get the best product.
Yep. So, to kind of wrap this up, I wanted to ask a question, because we've talked about how all this stuff costs more money, it's more time, it's more complicated. does every quote unquote modern house, does every more modern design have to cost more, or are there some strategies that we can employ to keep costs under control, to build a more cost effective version of that house?
I think the short answer is yes, it's possible to build a modern house on a budget. It's definitely a spectrum. There's a sliding scale of how modern do you want to go. There are a lot of elements in modern design that can be kind of pared back and thought of more simply to allow more tolerances and to make for an easier, more budget-friendly build for sure. One of those topics being like the punched openings versus huge sliders. We can do a really cool rhythm of, standard sized openings that still create that feeling of like a modern, airy, open, light-filled space, but don't have all the complexity surrounding them.
Mm-hmm. So I'll give a shout out to another architect real quick who we've worked with. I don't know if y'all know Michael Morrow, Kenny Morrow Architecture.
Yeah, familiar with
Michael is really, really good at executing a modern design with a lot of very simplistic elements. So we've done a project with Michael where like everything he spec'd was cheap. I couldn't believe it. Yeah. I get the material list of the stuff he wants to use. I'm like, is that going to look good? He's like, yeah, trust me. And the house turned out so cool, but it was all like really simple, inexpensive products, but they were installed in a sophisticated way. And there was a lot of planning that went into how these things are going to go together. Right. And so the labor was a little bit more to kind of make things happen a certain way, but the materials were super affordable.
Right.
So I love that mentality of how can we make this look really cool without spending a ton of money.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's this sort of, architectural pursuit in modern architecture to achieve things like that, have things actually be simple and efficient and clean. And so I definitely think that there's a way for modern architecture to cost less. And, we've been on traditional projects where it felt like there was just a lot of extra in the house, like faux beams and things like that are trying to get an aesthetic that is really kind of, it's a simulation of something that's no longer really happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you take that simulation away, this is modern life, there is less. So less can cost less. It's just a matter of designing smart, like you said in that example. I mean, there's a lot of great examples out there like that. And I think a lot of that too comes from trusting experienced designers who can bring stuff to the table that will work well together, that doesn't cost a lot. I think we do find ourselves accommodating high-end finishes. Someone, they saw something that looked really nice in the showroom, and they want to do that. And, of course, we want to make people's dreams, hopes and dreams come true.
Oh.
And so, and so we work with that, but I don't think that that's the only way to go about it. And, I think there are great examples in Houston of architects who do just really simple, kind of modest, but really effective, clean work that I admire a lot. And when I go to those houses, I'm just like walking around looking at their random trim and stuff because I'm like, wow, that's pretty clever,
Yeah.
And it's something that I could practically do myself.
Yeah. That's one of the great things about the world that we live in today, of like just the availability of kind of like knockoffs. Like for every super high end product, there's a generally kind of a comparable lesser product out there that you can accomplish the same general look and feel with that product. So you don't have to have the the $100,000 appliance package. You could get some similar appliance. Now it's not going to be that name brand, right? Like
Right.
if you're chasing having a certain brand in your house, that's not going to get you there. But if you're looking for a look and a feel, be still want some quality, there are some good alternatives to those products out there. So it's also making sure that the design team that you're working with understands your budget goals too, and they're sensitive to your budget goals and they respect your budget. That's something that I've experienced, is that the client maybe has stated their budget goals and the team's like, I'm gonna take them to this showroom over here. We're gonna buy this stuff because this is what I like as the designer. But you have to listen to the client and like what they can really afford,
Right.
and make it appropriate for their budget.
Right. Like, I'm a purist at heart. Faux anything really just irks my soul. But the porcelains are so good right now. Porcelain countertops and slabs, like, they just look so good. You would never even know the difference. And I think that's what we're starting to see more and more as like a really good value for these high-end looking finishes. And maybe the labor and the detailing is still high-end, but the material cost is actually less than if we went to, a stone yard and picked out 5 Carrera slabs,
Well, and actually a lot of that stuff has gone through a pretty good bit of R&D, because often those porcelain products, some of the engineered wood products, some of these things are used a lot in commercial applications, hotels, hospitality,
Right.
where they're getting a lot of traffic, and these materials have to be durable. And so just because you're using kind of one of these, quote unquote, lesser materials, that might be, getting a lot of heavy use in more of a commercial setting. And so that it's going to hold up to daily traffic. So I'm not advocating going and buying the cheapest alternative from China,
Right.
but as long as you're buying like a reasonable brand that it's not some totally cheap knockoff.
Yeah.
It probably has some support behind it.
Right.
Well, so another industry that, knockoffs is such a derogatory thing, but lighting, like for years we would spec $300 or $400 cans, really high end can lights, and then there was this kind of much cheaper kind of cheap stuff that oh yeah, you don't want that stuff, it's cheap, it's trash or whatever, but they're still around. And then 10 plus years later, they're offering all the same features. They've got a track record, and they are like a fraction of the price. And it's like, okay, can we keep ignoring this, or should we look into it? And we've had some success there where we want to do, we have a project with sophisticated kind of lighting needs, and we can pull that off without spending, 3 times what the normal cost would be.
Yep. All right. Well, I think we've spent a lot of time on this. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate you guys being here. I feel like we could probably keep this going for another hour. There's so many more things we haven't even touched on yet, but maybe we should do a part 2 sometime. So,
that'd be fun.
So Sam and Julie, thank you so much. Oh, just to kind of put a bow on it. So give me your takeaway. What's your biggest takeaway from our conversation? I'll start and maybe steal your ideas. So my big takeaway is kind of the same thing that we preach all the time on this podcast, and that is having a solid team and doing a lot of advanced planning. That's my number one thing on the podcast and my company. That's just what we believe in. So I think this conversation really reinforces that.
I think so too. Collaboration is such a big part of what we enjoy about the field of architecture, and we can only pull off these really cool, crisp designs by collaborating with the whole project team. There's kind of this, some people in our industry are very much like cliquish. Like they're like, that's your scope. I'm not figuring that out. I'm just the builder. I just do what you tell me to do. And then some architects are like, you're the builder, you're supposed to figure it out. But it's really that collaboration that we enjoy and that we think needs to be more understood, I think, in our field in general, and that really makes for successful projects.
For sure. Sam, what you got?
I think, as you know, from a designer standpoint, I think to kind of ensure success for the whole project team, I think it's good that we think about how our designs, what kind of design would be successful in different contexts. You know, like, are we in Houston where we basically have access to any number of expertise? Or are we in the middle of West Texas somewhere, and like, we're going to be, our project team is not going to be plucked from such a broad spectrum of experiences, you know? So how can our design fit in well with that context? I think, you know, and I don't think that that's a limiting thing. I think we can do really ambitious design, but work within the context that the project is in, can have a big impact on the overall outcome of the project. So
Great. All right, Sam Brisendine and Julie Wright, thank you so much for being here. And we'll be sure and put some links to Bright Architecture's website and social
Thank
media
you.
and all that stuff on the show notes. So thank you so much for being here.
awesome.
Thank you, Curtis.
And thank you all for listening to this episode of the Your Project Shepherd podcast. I will see you next time. Thanks.